Chapter 7. Sly Suspect. After dinner, Mr. Drew called the police department to inquire if they had learned anything about the burglar who had tried to steal the prayer rug. After a somewhat lengthy conversation, he put the phone down and relayed a disappointing message to Nancy. "No leads at all on that man who tried to steal the rug," he said. "Chief McGinnis thinks the fellow has probably left town." "That's too bad," said Nancy. "I keep wondering if he'll make another attempt to get into this house. Dad, I noticed you had special burglar-proof locks put on both the front and back doors." "Yes," her father replied. "I'll give you and Hannah keys. But anybody as clever as that fellow can probably figure out a way to unlock them." The Drews agreed that there was no use worrying about it. They would not live in fear. Nancy's father asked, "Have you found any more clues in the border of the rug?" "No, but I think I'll work on it a little right now." She went upstairs to her room, brought the rug to the living room, and laid it on the floor. Nancy moved a lamp close, showing up the design clearly. For some time there was silence in the room as the young detective and her father, sitting on the floor, endeavored to find another clue. "This is frustrating," Mr. Drew remarked half an hour later. He grinned. "I admit I'm getting a bit stiff sitting in this position. I think I'll walk around outdoors a little. Want to come along, Nancy?" "You bet," she said eagerly. From earliest childhood, Nancy had been thrilled whenever her father had said, "Let's take a walk." She had learned a good deal about trees, shrubs, flowers, and birds from him. As they walked along the darkened street, Nancy said, "I hear an owl." "That's right," her father agreed. He chuckled. "Hear what the wise old one is saying?" Nancy listened, then she giggled. "It sounds as if he were saying, 'You will, you will.'" "Exactly," Mr. Drew said. "I'll bet when we get back to the house you'll discover another part of Farouk's message." Nancy squeezed her father's arm. "Are you tired of walking?" she asked with a grin. "I can hardly wait to search the rug for more clues." Father and daughter laughed and circled several adjoining side streets. Finally, they returned to the house. Nancy sped into the living room and dropped to the floor. She again scrutinized the border of the rug. To Nancy's delight, her father's prediction came true. She found 2 more words. Her too. "Oh, Dad, you were right!" she called out. The lawyer walked in and looked. "Now the instructions are, Carson, find mannequin. I love her. Carry her to..." But where? Nancy continued her search until she became sleepy, but found nothing. She folded up the rug and took it to her bedroom. Early the next morning, she telephoned George, then Bess. George was already up, but Bess sounded very sleepy. "Want to help me with some sleuthing?" Nancy asked. Both girls said yes, but Bess begged for a full hour to get ready. "No hurry," said Nancy. "We're just going downtown in the vicinity of the tailor shop and find out from people who live or work there what they may know about the mannequin." Nancy once more took out the rug and began to study it. She had barely begun when the front doorbell rang and Hannah admitted George. "I decided to walk over and save Nancy the trip to my house," she said. "Nancy's upstairs," said the housekeeper. "Go right up." George joined Nancy in the search for further words or symbols. A few minutes later, she said, "I think I found something. It looks like NST." Nancy stared at the section to which George was pointing. She smiled. "You're absolutely right. I wonder if it's part of a word. And also, is it French or English or something else?" The 2 girls continued the search. It was several minutes before George found 2 more letters, L-E. Nancy sat back on her heels, trying to figure out if there was any connection between the 2 groups. She could think of nothing. Finally, she took paper and pencils from her desk for herself and George. "Let's try to decipher this thing," she said. Nancy sat at her desk and George at the dressing table. Using the letters NST and LE, they tried to make a word. Every few minutes they would heave sighs of disappointment, but suddenly Nancy gave a shout. "I have it!" she said. "What is it?" George asked. "Constantinople!" George stared at the young detective in admiration. "That used to be the name of Istanbul." "Exactly." Nancy began dancing around the room in exuberance. "The mannequin is to be taken to Istanbul." The news was too good to keep. As George hurried downstairs to tell Hannah Gruen, Nancy telephoned her father. "That's great," he said, then chuckled. "Nancy, it begins to look as if you might have to go to Istanbul." "And you too," she said. "We'll see about that," he replied. "Farouk is certainly guarding his secret well. It was clever of him to use letters from the old name of Istanbul as a disguise." By this time an hour had passed. Nancy and George got into the convertible and went to pick Bess up. "Hi, sleepyhead," George greeted her cousin. "You missed all the excitement." "Tell me about it," Bess begged. Upon hearing of the message to bring the mannequin to Istanbul, her eyes popped wide open. "Are you going?" she asked Nancy. "How can I? I don't have the mannequin, and I have no idea where she is. By the way, the father of the boy we saved runs a travel agency and has arranged a trip to Turkey." George grinned. "When do we start?" There was no more conversation until the girls reached Satcher Street. Then Nancy suggested that they separate to make inquiries about the mannequin. She would take the center section, while the girls inquired at the two ends. Nancy spoke to the shopkeepers on either side of Mr. Anthony's shop. Both said they had moved there after Farouk had left and knew nothing about his business. The young detective went across the street to interview shopkeepers there, but had no better luck until she went into a bakery. The owner said that he could not help her, but he was sure that Mrs. Bamer, who occupied an apartment above his shop, would be able to give her some information. She's lived in this neighborhood for many years. Nancy rang the bell of Mrs. Bamer's apartment, and a pleasant-looking woman came to the door. The girl smiled and said she was trying to find the mannequin that used to be in Farouk Tahmasp's window. "Have you any idea where she was taken?" Mrs. Bamer shook her head. "Please come in," she said, and led the way to her living room. She motioned Nancy to a chair near a front window. In the conversation that followed, Nancy learned that the mannequin had never been left in the window overnight, and at times it did not even appear in the daytime. Her costume was often changed. "I thought this might be some kind of Muslim custom," Mrs. Bamer said. "Have you any idea," Nancy asked, "where Farouk Tahmasp went?" "No. The whole thing happened so suddenly everyone around here was puzzled. We assumed that the rug dealer had taken the mannequin with him. No one knew why he had left. Although he seemed to have no particular friends, he was a nice person. I understand he didn't owe anyone a cent when he left." The woman sighed. "I sometimes think he got homesick and went back to his native land." Since Mrs. Bamer could not provide any further information about Farouk, Nancy changed the subject. "Do you know who the humorous old man is who spends a lot of time in the tailor shop? The one who laughs a lot?" Mrs. Bamer grinned. "Oh, I know who you mean. He's half cracked, but sometimes he hits the truth in what he says." "What's his name?" Nancy asked. "His last name is Hyde, and his nickname is Ha Ha. He likes to be called that." Mrs. Bamer warned Nancy to be careful of telling Ha Ha anything she did not want passed along. "He's a great gossip." Nancy stood up. "Mrs. Bamer, I appreciate all this information." She happened to glance out the window and gasped. A young man lounging in a doorway across the street was the Drews' burglar. Nancy hurriedly said goodbye to Mrs. Bamer and ran down to the street. Knowing that it would be unwise to confront him alone, the young sleuth went into the bakery and asked the owner to telephone the police. "In the meantime, I'll trail the suspect if he leaves." The baker was very glad to cooperate. Nancy watched from inside. The man in the doorway suddenly started up the street at a brisk pace. Nancy turned to the baker. "Please ask the police to follow me up the street." Nancy dashed to the sidewalk and hurried after the young man. She wondered if he was wearing a gold filigree bracelet studded with turquoise. He began walking so fast that it was almost a run. Nancy was still nearly a block behind. Between milling pedestrians and heavy street traffic, she had a difficult time keeping him in sight. Fortunately, he did not turn any corners. "Oh, I hope the police will hurry," she said to herself. At that moment, the suspect stopped abruptly. A young woman coming up a side street also stopped. Nancy noticed that she was very pretty and had long black hair. The man whipped a letter from a pocket and handed it to her. She opened it quickly and read the message, which apparently was short but disturbing. She burst into tears. It really must be bad news, Nancy thought. She continued to move closer, but at a slower pace in order to see more of the drama. The young man put an arm about the girl and drew her to him. She pushed him away and shook her head violently. He tried again. This time she used her fist against his chest to shove him away. Nancy was so intent on the scene that she had not noticed a car coming up alongside her. Now she turned to look at it. The police! And Bess and George were in the rear seat. "What's up?" George called out. At that instant, the Drews burglar spotted Nancy and the police. He said something to the girl with him. They turned in opposite directions and fled along the side street. "Bess and George, follow that girl," Nancy said. "The police and I will go after the burglar." End of chapter 7.